Well, with much anticipation in the chat box, we got to get heading over to New Zealand and the resignation of Jacinda Ardern.
That's right, Mike. You know, it's a lot of gloom and doom sometimes on this news program, and we don't often get a chance to do a real, true, feel-good story, but once in a while they do come around on the news cycle, and this is one of those. Jacinda Ardern has announced her resignation, and it couldn't come too soon for a lot of New Zealand residents. But let's just look at the reaction here from the Walkabout pub somewhere in New Zealand. Let's take a look at the announcement and how people reacted.
And so today I'm announcing that I will not be seeking re-election and that my term as Prime Minister will conclude no later than the 7th of February.
Well, now, full disclosure, that's a really famous meme template that a lot of people use, so it's not that's not actual footage from New Zealand. But nonetheless, so Mike, you know, they finally put this horse out to pasture. There's a lot of people making a lot of accusations and theories. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of denials on the part of the government. So let's look at what the press is saying here. Of course, you can expect the Guardian's going to be defending her right to the hilt. It's worth pointing out Jacinda Ardern is a protege of Tony Blair. She really cut her teeth working for Tony. So, you know, Tony Blair made her into the political figure, go figure, that she's become. But here's what the Guardian are saying. This is the reason why she's resigned here, because of abuse and threats that's contributed to her resignation. Here's Kate Hanna, someone we've featured on the program last week from the Disinformation Project down in Auckland, at the Auckland University here, and she's saying that their think tank has charted a significant increase in abuse, threatening material directed at Ardern, and believe it had likely contributed to her leaving the role. That's not what she said in her departure speech, but...
No, but correct me if I'm wrong. This type of thing in the past would have been called political activism.
Would have been called, criticism of public figures and things like that. So, you know, this leads us to another problem, Mike. And besides that, you know, this Disinformation Project is just unbelievable in the amount of propaganda they put out. But their politicians, and some, especially in small countries, have a real problem, Mike, dealing with criticism. And you can see this sort of backlash, this visceral reaction from the state. They don't like it. They don't like the fact that Twitter provides this sort of level playing field where Joe Public and the plebs, the deplorables, get to touch famous people by tagging them in tweets, and the criticism, the memes and things like this, they're horrified by it. And we'll tell you why that is, because especially in the case of Jacinda Ardern, she has cultivated a certain type of political brand, and she's really traded off that, Mike. And I think we've all seen that. We've reported on it here, and other outlets have. But just further on here on this one, so the scope of what we've observed over the last 3 years is such that there's no way it could not have been a contributing factor for any person, said Kate Hanna from the Disinformation Project, who gets government funding, by the way. So state-funded think tanks and media commenting about the government they've been trying to protect for 3 years. So that's an interesting development there. And so let's look at the rest of the conversation on this. What's the real reason, Mike, why she's resigning? She says it's because she wants to spend more time with her family, because there's nothing left in the tank, she said. And what else? The demands of the job are just too much, and she's human and she wants to get back to her real life. But the reality is there's a general election coming up, and her party has been tanking in the polls, and she herself, her approval rating is really dropped massively. They're looking at a huge defeat in the upcoming general election. As leader, maybe her party could do better without her, because she's very unpopular, despite what the global media and the World Economic Forum crowd and the Guardian like to portray her as. So here's the real reason. Here's just a little highlight reel of her.
No, before we get to that, there's one more quote here that I think we need to mention, because this is really important. The final thing Kate said, if we just bring that back on screen. Kate Hanna we're talking about here, and the final thing she said was about death threats.
Yes.
And this is really important, because we were just talking the other day, Patrick, about death threats the imagery around death threats, the Oxford County Council getting death threats over the 15-minute city programme that they've got going on. Every time we see criticism, political criticism or criticism of the actions of think tanks or others, the term death threat is immediately brought up. So we're getting this constant narrative that anybody that's critical of the mainstream policy agenda is somehow an extremist who is threatening to kill.
And they don't explicitly say death threats, as you look up on this quote here. Incredibly violent use of imagery around death threats.
Right.
And they're trying to associate that with Jacinda Ardern. They don't give any specific examples of it.
Right.
It's just generally, oh, it's really negative and it's abusive and so forth. But you know, you have to remember, this is somebody who locked down the whole country for one PCR positive case, destroyed the economy, and really just created a whole atmosphere of misery for so many people, shut down schools, and many will argue that she was abusive. Her government were abusive of their electorate. And so you can see the defenders of Ardern saying, no, it's the online trolling and things like that. No, not really. Let's take a look at some of her finer moments over the last couple of years.
Stay local and do not congregate. Don't talk to your neighbours. Please keep to your bubbles. It comes down again to those very simple principles. We know from overseas cases of the Delta variant that it can be spread by people simply walking past one another. So keep those movements outside to the bare minimum. If someone refuses in our facilities to be tested, they have to keep staying. So they won't be able to leave after 14 days. They have to stay on for another 14 days. So it's a pretty good incentive. You either get your tests done and make sure you're cleared, or we will keep you in a facility longer. So I think most people will look at that and say, I'll take the test. You can now see family and friends again in their homes and use the bathroom inside. Luxury. Anytime to clarify any rumour you may hear, covid19.govt.nz. Otherwise, dismiss anything else. We will continue to be your single source of truth. We will provide
Your single source of truth. That is just such an incredible statement at the end.
Yeah, I mean, and really patronizing as well. And she's kind of this attitude, and she's cultivated, does a lot of these acting skits that they push out as propaganda. She's constantly making a show of herself. Here's one where she's doing one of her, selfies there. It's kind of, but this is one of the government-funded COVID stuff that we featured last week. Even some of their journalists were saying this government promises to be open and transparent, but it is an artfully crafted image here. And this is Andrea Vance. And this is what she said: in my 20-year career as a journalist, this government is one of the most thin-skinned and secretive I have ever experienced. Many of my colleagues stay the same. So that's the real story of Jacinda Ardern from pro-government journalists even. That's how bad it is in New Zealand. And sort of The Guardian isn't giving you any bit of a whiff of any of this reality, by the way. They're just there to protect her political brand. So I think that's interesting. And even squeezing basic facts out of an agency is frustrating, torturous, and often a futile exercise. Wow, sound familiar, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
So it's pretty bad down in New Zealand. So Jacinda Ardern wasn't looking good. This is probably one of the best takes I've seen. Ross Clark at the Telegraph, and this headline says it all. Poor Jacinda Ardern, defeated by her own vanity. She believed her own myth that she was the most virtuous leader in the world. Then came the consequences of her disastrous actions. This is actually an incredibly insightful article here in the Telegraph. And this is what Ross Clark has to say here. I don't claim to be able to read her mind, but I would guess that her real reason for resigning ahead of the New Zealand's general election later this year was not primarily that she wanted to collect her daughter from playgroup every day, as she intimated, but that she could no longer cope with her halo having slipped. Very well said, Mr. Ross Clark. And he goes on, when you have built up into a living saint, it must come as a shock to find yourself under attack for failing to address the same old problems which afflict less progressive national leaders. Inflation, a stuttering economy, rising crime are hardly unique to New Zealand, but they showed that they were nothing There was nothing magical about Ardern's politics. The only difference is that in her case, she lacked the toughness to weather serious adversity. Very strong criticism there from Ross Clark, but so true, Mike. So true. This magical saint-like image that they crafted for her, it has just totally imploded. She knows it. That's why she's cutting and running. She's been in office 6 years. Hardly a dynasty by anyone's measure. Usually it's the 10-year mark, isn't it? But anyway, so we'll go here, and just a reminder here, she's constantly patronizing minority groups and trying to paint this kind of universal, ethnically friendly leader of the world. I guess world president is probably the right term, what she was trying to cultivate, much like Tony Blair, the Barack Obama style globalist leadership. Here she is after the Christchurch shooting, and you know that's the money shot, getting that sort of face, the hijab in the mosque, and then apologizing for historic injustices against Native Americans by offering herself up for a Maori ceremony. I mean, a lot of people would call this theatrics and politically, but this is what Ardern did. This is how she developed her brand, and that was her success, at least in the international community, and up until COVID, and then things went a little bit wrong, Mike, and this is what happened afterwards. And this is why her popularity was plummeting. These were the protests that have just put so much pressure on the government there. And this is a very small country, New Zealand. So, I mean, when you have a couple 100,000 people out in Wellington, that's significant. It's the equivalent of 300,000 or 1 million camping in London at the Capitol. And the police had to be very heavy-handed at the end because the government just couldn't take the public relations disaster of people going against the lockdowns, the vaccine mandates, and so forth. So this is, you know, that's the real story of her fall from grace. And this is why her party is tanking in the polls. But there's another scandal lurking behind the scenes that we want to bring people's attention to. And let's just take a look at this. This is on Substack. This is Cranmer's Substack. This is a 2-part article. I really encourage everybody to read it. The government is implicated in a really, really potentially damaging scandal regarding the approval and pushing vaccines on children. The government seems to have downplayed and ignored expert advice, even from their own scientific committee, about the dangers to children, specifically to do with myocarditis. Okay, so there's a lot in here. These are 2 very long and extensive articles here, but there is clear evidence in the official documents that it was agreed that references to increasing dosing intervals as a method of potentially providing some protection against myocarditis should be removed from public communications. That's just a little taste of it. There was a reluctance within government to fully articulate the myocarditis risk to young people, provide them with advice, for instance, on resting after vaccination, as was given in Singapore, and give consideration to offering the adenovirus vector vaccine to young males. That's in part 1. Part 2, this is an interesting passage here, Mike. Consideration should be given to permitting younger people who have had 1 dose to be permitted to work or undertake other activities covered by the mandate. So this shows you how they were strong-arming even young people with the vaccine mandate, and the acknowledgement that there was a risk of myocarditis, but even the government saying, well, just spread the doses out. What a nightmare this is. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Within this scandal could it potentially explode. And legally, in terms of liability and things like that, this is just the beginning. And I think Ardern knew about this. They saw the writing on the wall, and it was a good time to jump ship.
Right.
So they'll rehabilitate her image and hopefully get her back at Davos next January.
Well, hopefully for them, perhaps.
Yeah.
Hopefully for us, because it's always a comedy show. But
that's the plan.
Yes.
That's the plan.